your great presentation, short to the point and very informative. Many panels that I attend could take a lot of lessons from all of you, so I salute you. A couple of questions. Alton,
Yes.
On the, when you look at the High Mountain Adaptation Partnership, was there talk about the ability to predict downslope flooding events other than glacial lakes, but the things that happen in Bangladesh a couple of days after a massive melt-off? Was there talk about the actual ability to predict and improving that at all? Or is that something that you guys are looking at? Again, not having read the literature.
Yeah, the problem is, when you're talking about a glacial lake, you get a glacial lake outburst flood as a result of triggers. All right, triggers can be an earthquake, it can be a mass of overhanging ice that shakes loose, falls into the lake, creates a surge wave, breaks the moraine. You get millions and millions of cubic meters of water unleashed and causing destruction downstream. The problem right now is that it's difficult to predict with any real certainty when these are going to happen. We know they're going to happen because these lakes are receding year after year after year, meaning eventually they're going to get up against the mountain wall, which means the ice is overhanging directly, okay? And with warmer climates, you know, it's a certainty, they're going to happen. So really what we can do is we can reduce the risk, much as like Cesar has done. Cesar has lowered something like 20 different glacial lakes in the Cordillera Blanca of Peru, in that way saving thousands and thousands of lives by preventing a glacial lake outburst flood.
One, if I can just chime in on that, the USAID NASA program called Severe last year developed a tool to help provide an early warning of flood in Bangladesh based on river height in India. Prior to this, the Indians would not release data on flood stage in rivers. And now we're getting it with satellites, and so we can provide an 8-day warning rather than a 3-day warning. And I'm not the one who manages Severe, but I can certainly put you in touch with my colleague who does.
That would be great to understand.
Sure.
Talking a lot with the military in Bangladesh about those things too, so I appreciate it. So, Joanne, as far as urban issues, are there in the report, or are there some great examples of returns on investment of urban planning and adaptation that have already saved money? Great article in National Geographic recently about what it would cost Miami to become more climate resilient. In the end, you know, how do you make a decision to spend billions now as opposed to tens of billions later? Nobody wants to spend billions now unless they're sure of it. Are there some great examples that we can use when we're engaging others? Are they in the report, or can we get those, I guess, is my question.
I actually think that sort of financial analysis is our next big challenge. We didn't do detailed economic analyses, and some of that economic analysis is tough to do because a lot of the changes that can make a huge difference are policy and institutional, as well as hard investments. And so, for example, if one of the changes we did in Peru is to work with them to get climate risk criteria incorporated into their urban development policies, so that going forward, every project that's invested in will have to be climate resilient. And we haven't attempted to quantify the financial impact of that. Do others on the panel have anything to add on this?
I'll just say that one of the problems that I've seen, not on this project, but just in other aspects of work and life, is in developing countries you see donors come in and invest on behalf of a developing country. And I used to live in Niger, and someone funded the building or the rebuilding of a road. The lowest bid was from a Croatian company who built the road to Zagreb heat tolerances, and this was in one of the hottest capitals in the world, and every day between 10 and 3, the asphalt turned back into tar, and so there were ruts this deep in the road within weeks of them building it, and it was the busiest road in town. And I knew the road crew, and they said, we knew this was going to happen, but we were told to build it the way we did, and we didn't know it would be this bad, and now we don't have the funding to to fix it. So I haven't been back to Niger in about a decade, but I suspect there's still troughs in the road.
Thank you. One final question, then I'll shut up. Lily, for you, the issue of marine protected areas, there's been a lot of work recently from the President's Task Force on illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing and fraudulent seafood, tasking to Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security as well to provide maritime domain awareness tools, information to combat that with our partners possibly. So I guess when you get into the marine protected areas, one of the big issues that always comes up is monitoring and enforcement related to maritime domain awareness. Is that a topic that sort of permeates a lot of the discussion, or did even in Africa? You know, and there's some great examples like the Gulf of Guinea where they've made some huge progress on that in recent years. Thanks.
Yeah, so actually the third training, which is taking place later this year, will touch on tools and how to monitor activities in MPAs, and that was a challenge that a lot of participants brought up, especially with overfishing and a lot of the MPAs. It's a huge issue that they see, so they really want to be able to get more training on how to monitor that, what kind of tools are available that they can afford to get to use in their MPA. So that's something that we will be covering in the following training.
Great. I would just, as one of my hats, the head of the office of the DoD Executive Agent for Maritime Domain Awareness, feel free to partner with DoD in some of the ongoing efforts across the military we have with partners, Coast Guards, and military, so we may be able to help you along the
Great.
lines of that.
Thank you.
That's all I got. Sorry for the mini.
Why don't we go back to Jim, and then we'll come back here.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentations. I don't want to do Lawrence's job, so I'm not going to summarize, but I have heard some common themes emerge from your presentations. For example, that we need to make sure that the work is in the context of the place we're working, that we need to engage stakeholders from the outset. This is really for the whole panel, is that what would you advise if USAID were to do another program like CCRD into the future, so that it builds off of your learnings, so that that's the starting point, because you do have some common threads, and we would like to make sure that the next program really does build off of that. So what would that look like?
Oh, turn your mic on.
That's a good question. I have a number of thoughts on that. One is that the people that are participating, they need to have skin in the game. There needs to be something that drives them to participate. Otherwise, they're going to be pretty loose participants, and they're going to jettison as soon as the thing is done, as soon as their per diem is spent out and they go home. Second is you need to include a diversity of participants. One of the really valuable things, I think, in all of our discussions was hearing from a range of folks. So avoid the echo chamber. Kind of second and a half is go to where people are. I think that many of the adaptation partnership activities were sort of on-site, in situ, and that's really valuable because there are things that one can learn by being there, being in the field, that you can't learn from being in a place like this. Another consideration is focus from the beginning on producing outputs that are useful to everybody who's in the room. And kind of drive toward outputs, drive toward things that are of common use to all of the participants. Another thing is that funding streams need to be identified right up front. So the funders, so it's nice to have people who are sort of actively participating kind of from the bottom up there, stakeholders and you know, folks who are in the scientific domain, et cetera, but the funders need to be there, because if the activity is going to have legs, you got to be thinking about the funding right up front. And one of the things that I think is particularly potent is when you have like a grant funding stream that's tied to this, so that the people who are participating in this, people who have skin in the game, come up with ideas. They know that there's a pot of money that they can tap into, and this will have legs. And then kind of finally, I'd say that there need to be champions. There need to be people there whose day job it will be to carry this forward. Kind of in the absence of, I think, any of those pieces, you get less than a satisfactory result.
Anybody else?
I'll just add one other point. I think in the climate services realm, one of the things that we've been very aware of over the past years, that there are actually a number of major programs and activities that are being developed that have to do with climate services. You have at the intergovernmental level, we have the UN-led global framework for climate services, where a lot of attention is going, a lot of momentum is building, and a lot of national commitments are being made. And so we have that. And of course, in many countries, there are growing national programs, and then in sector-based organizations, like, let me use CCAFs as an example, there are growing initiatives. One of the things that we see, let me mention another activity. World Bank sponsors the pilot program for climate resilience, which is investing hundreds of millions of dollars at this stage in things that involve climate services. So we've managed to, in this first phase, if you will, of our partnership, which is an informal partnership that cuts across all of these, we've been able to bring these folks together. And I think they all speak to the benefits of doing that. At the same time, we have not yet sort of gotten at the level of sort of working programmatically together, which includes aspects of thinking about how the investments being made in each of those programs could be tied together a bit more. And in my mind, in our arena, that is the big opportunity and challenge that we're faced right now. Is like tying these major efforts together in a way that we're doing one good thing that everyone believes in, but also have the resources and other things that are needed to sustain it. So that going forward, that's what I think is big for us.
I'd throw in a couple additional thoughts. One is, I think that CCRD has been really effective in working at with different units of analysis. So I've been focusing on cities, we've had the high mountains, we've had the rural. I think there's an opportunity to think more systemically because as I was working at the local government level, so much of the stresses and the opportunities or the resources were from the regional level and then or from the national level. And so projects that make the governance links and the decision links across different levels of government and across different ecological levels, I think would be really interesting. I think that the points that Peter touched on about integrating climate change into other major efforts, peacekeeping, disaster response, I think that connecting the dots between climate change and these other efforts, I think, poses a big opportunity. And I think that there's a real big opportunity to take what we've developed and multiply it, get it out there, take it to other cities, just take it on the road, which involves training, additional resources to really take the lessons we've learned and get them out there.
I'd like to add one thing. I think that our Peru program was quite successful in moving to the next level through the new grant that I mentioned from USAID Peru, $3 million to launch over the next 3 years a program called Securing Mountain Water and Livelihoods. So in addition to this the phase one activities of the local adaptation plans of action and the glacial lake focus, they've now moved up to the next level to work with to build the capacity of a range of universities, local governments, and local communities in the Ancash department to build their skills to adapt to climate change. So I think that would be a good model to follow for a next phase in Nepal and elsewhere in Asia.
And I'll just add very briefly that I think one of the things that was sort of a disappointment to me was we tried to get multiple donors to actively participate in this partnership, and we had a hard time. And I think we really only had one, I think only the M&E workshop was co-sponsored, really led by GIZ. Spain did some workshops, Costa Rica did some workshops, but they weren't with us. So nobody was really willing to share ownership. And as we roll out the National Adaptation Planning Network that we talked about a bit yesterday, we're really trying to work with other donors and with other countries so that we don't run the risk of either not having enough follow-on funding or of having one organization do an activity and then another one come in 3 weeks later and do the exact same thing. Captain Goodrow.
Yeah, Peter, I've got a two-parter for you. One, have you seen that the approach of merging this into conflict resolution, has it been simply limited to conflict resolution, or is there enough awareness of the issues that you've seen success in conflict avoidance and building regional partnerships around these issues? And given the context and the framework for analysis, have you seen that there's enough concern that you can get beyond the discussion on the primary impact and some of the catastrophic destruction that people see and get past that into second, third order impact that cause resource scarcity driving conflict? Or are the natures of the relationships contentious enough that you can only talk about that primary issue and it's not advanced enough as an issue to get into those deeper discussions?
Well, I'd really like, thanks. Great questions. I'd really like my colleagues who are conflict analysts to participate with me in answering that. So you'll get a second best or a fifth best answer from me. So I think that, what we're doing here is we're not inventing the wheel. We're really trying to build on the work that has been going on for decades in terms of conflict analysis and peace building. And to the extent that those efforts have been successful in the past, I think that, I have optimism for the future. I think this area of linking together conflict analysis and climate adaptation is a pretty new one. It's so many years old-ish. And it's probably too early to say that we have demonstrable results from these intentional efforts to do this, but to the extent that there has been effectiveness in the past in conflict analysis up to this point that maybe hasn't intentionally been for the purposes of climate change adaptation and simultaneously conflict analysis and peace building, then yeah. And I think what we want to do going forward is to be able to demonstrate what the added value of being intentional about this is, and this partnership sees potential in that intentionality going forward. And then regarding your second point, I think that the people in the room, in the rooms, felt very strongly that a holistic view is needed, that it doesn't make sense to kind of take a narrow view, that the broader we can be looking at these issues and the more inclusive the conflict analysis can be and the associated peace building, the more robust it can be going forward. Because I think one of the dangers that we see, and I think something that just frankly we, and I'll point my finger at myself, in the adaptation community do, is we glom onto a solution, and it might just be a partial solution because we're focused on making sure that the X utility gets Y natural resource, that there's water that's supplied into this particular system, but we're not thinking about at whose expense. And that's something that I think we need to do much more and have a much more sort of holistic view. So I think that kind of on the question of should we be narrow or broad, I'd really recommend broad at the outset to make sure that we're getting the right voices, to understand who the aggrieved are, and in the process are putting in place adaptation actions that have the potential to have longevity because people aren't going to be pot shooting at them. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but.
And just one real quick comment. Cynthia Brady, who is in the Dacha Bureau and really led the effort to develop that, was talking with Alton's colleagues in Peru about the work that they've been doing that spun out of this partnership. And Cynthia saw the work there at managing water and bringing different stakeholders together as a peace-building effort. And Alton's colleague kept saying, no, we're just trying to manage the water better. So I think there may be more going on than the two communities realize. And so as the communities continue to talk, there may be a more active recognition that good practice in one area is also good practice in another, and we may be doing more than we realize unconsciously. Jonathan and then Glenn.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Jonathan Cook from USAID. Just kind of stretching here to get the mic. Thanks for all the great presentations. Just on the issue of ownership and sort of sustainability, I thought it was a very interesting to hear all of the presenters talk about the different models. And, you know, there's a range of models in a way for how these partnerships kind of came out of the different workshops. You had a few partnerships that, you know, were led by members of this project or groups that were involved in this project that have continued. You also had some interesting models from Central America and also maybe with the MPAs where there was a regional organization that became really important. You had WIOMSA and Cartier and Alex's group that also kind of play a role in maintaining some of the energy and the ideas. And I just wondered if others, you know, people on the panel could talk a bit about those different models and how they might help as all of these partnerships kind of are pivoting into the next range, the next round or the next phase of kind of sustainability. Thank you.
Because I can never resist, I'll say a few words. I think the reason we had different models was where the strengths of the CCRD team lay and where the opportunities came from outside. For the MPA work, we wanted and needed to work with NOAA, and I think NOAA already had relationships with WIOMSA. Nora, who is no longer with AID, helped set up the Central America workshop, and she already knew some of the organizations in Central America. It was, you know, in the case of climate services, IRI was a logical leader, and they were already putting on for NOAA and the UK Met that first conference, and so we built on them. Another alternative there might have been the WMO, but I don't think we would have gotten the type of results that we got. I think one of the advantages of having worked with the Central American organizations, and hopefully we'll see this with WIOMSA, is that they're going to hopefully be more adroit at going after non-U.S. funding to keep things going, whereas U.S. organizations tend to be better suited to going after U.S. funding, not because of their own skill set, but because external donors tend to look at an American organization and say, well, that's a U.S. organization, we'll let the U.S. fund that, we're going to look to our own. Anybody have anything to add to that? No? Glenn? We have about 5 minutes left, I think.
Well, I don't know if my question's much different, and I was expecting a couple of our community of practice people to step up to the table here, so I'm going to try again. One of the challenges that we issued yesterday, that was discussed in Jonathan's presentation and Peter's and my presentation, is how do we sort of keep, you know, there's this climate resilient development framework, and how do we push it outside the agency? And two-part question is, what role can communities of practice play in helping us to push some of the good research, some of the good policy work, and, you know, the application of the climate resilient development framework outside of USAID? And obviously, the second part of that question is, where are you going to get financing for the communities of practice?
Anybody else?
Well, I personally think that the communities of practice at the national level or the local level are a lot easier to sustain. And then the international ones are more expensive because you have a lot of, for example, traveling, even in Central America, a small region, but it's still very expensive. And then, yeah, there are some obstacles, especially with the government and sort of setting aside time to follow up on some of the activities. But at the national level, it's a lot more feasible with local resources, which is something that we are trying to do in the case of Guatemala, where we have a climate change law in place, and there's real momentum between different sectors of society, academia and private sector and the government sort of pushing and working towards that, but sort of securing some minimum level of funding for the community of practice, at least to keep going. That is very important. But I think at a larger scale, then we do need some help. But it is possible. And I would think that the more stable partners are the ones that could really take on the communities of practice, for example, universities, research centers, because in governments, they change. In some countries, everybody changes in government. So that is a real obstacle for the continuity of these processes. That's what I'd like to add.
Well, building on what I said before, I think, like in our case, I think that there are ways to think about significant initiatives that may already be nearly global that are happening, but have not had exactly the community of practice dimension that we've been fostering, but who benefit from it. That to the extent that some of what we've been organizing under the community of practice could be reoriented in a way toward specific deliverables for those entities. I think that's one way that we could sort of transform into a different kind of future. There is, however, another kind of aspect to what we've been doing, and as I've been reflecting on it lately, it really has a lot of the spirit of a professional association, where you actually are bringing together like-minded, although diverse, but still like-minded and like-purposed folks that are around an issue, because they feel that there's some gains to them to participate and to, there are things that they can benefit from, take advantage of, resources and the like. But what we didn't do is to think of organizing ourselves in anything like a professional association. We don't have membership fees or dues or things like that, or even contributions to the annual workshops. And we've started to do that, but only in a small way. On the other hand, if you look at associations, they go typically further than we do in creating resources for their members. So some kind of redirection of that dimension that would be a little more like a professional association might be another way to sustain that part of what we've been doing. So those are the two kind of arenas that at least I see right now.
Peter and then Alton, and then we need to wrap up in about 2 minutes.
Okay. I agree with everything that's been said. Glenn, I think that, picking up on Steve's point about like-minded people, I think we need to be looking for communities, in which we can grow the climate resilient development framework approach with people that it's not just nice to have this, but that they must have it. And it's communities that are focused on development, and I think that's really sort of why we came up with the approach that we did, which is this development-first approach, because it's a development-first approach for a development agency as opposed to a climate-first approach for a development agency. So what I'm getting at is that as we look to extend this and to grow it and to scale it, we had, I think, some good discussion yesterday about scaling, that we need to think about where are those sort of those early wins that we can get for the scaling. And I think it's in those places that have this kind of development first or decision first or context first mindset. And I mentioned that conflict analysis is one of those communities, that they don't go into it really from first thinking about the hazards, they really make sure that they understand the governance situation, they understand the decision-making context, and then think about how the stressors are exacerbating those dynamics. So that's one community. Another community that I think it's ripe for growth of this kind of development-first approach on climate change is with the disaster risk reduction community, where again, they're thinking about the context. Yes, it comes out of this understanding of, hazards cause disasters, and we need to deal with that and prepare for it and reduce them. But the DRR community has been working for decades on thinking about the governance and the capacity to prepare, the capacity to respond, the capacity to reduce the vulnerabilities to these disasters. And I think that there's a ripe sort of setting there for people that must do this. And so because it's a must do, it's not a nice to have, I think that we can work with them. And I think that's sort of a lens that I'd like to see us explore, working with those communities that share that similar view and that must approach this.
Alton, last word?
Yeah, in terms of building and sustaining a community of practice, Glenn, I always thought that there were a lot of lessons to be learned from the Mountain Forum years ago, which was in effect a community of practice of some 3,000 mountain specialists around the world. Why was it successful? Probably because it was kind of new, at the time, but also we had a moderator who had high credibility in the mountain world, and who on a daily basis was contacting and reaching out to all these community of practice members and saying, hey, have you published a new paper? What about your new book, et cetera, getting them directly involved. And that resulted in a very dynamic, there were e-conferences every other month or so. That resulted in a very dynamic community of practice and partnerships and new workshops. But remember, the Swiss were funding it too. The Swiss were paying for salaries. So you've got to have some core funding to realistically keep these things going.
And then I'll remind everybody that the first part of that, the Adaptation Partnership publications that state funded is on building and sustaining communities of practice. So we should all go back and look at that. It's been a few years, but there's a lot of good advice in that. I want to respect everyone's schedule, so I think we have the room for another 20 or 30 minutes, but we should wrap up formally so that those who need to leave can do so. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Remember, this afternoon, if you've registered, we're at the Cosmos Club for another discussion of the mountain work and some beautiful videos. Tomorrow, we are at the Carnegie Endowment starting at 9 o'clock again. Tomorrow's focus is on urban issues, and then Thursday, we're also at Carnegie Endowment, and the focus is on, in the morning, on climate services, so much more detailed discussion on climate services, and then in the afternoon is a discussion of next steps or new directions for USAID. Remember, if you want to sign up for the soft launch of the Climate Links web portal, please tick the box on the registration form outside, and feel free to stick around and ask questions of each other or the speakers, but we will formally end right now. Thank you very much.